Good morning and good afternoon. My name is Adam Day. I'm the Director of Programs at the Center for Policy Research at UN University. And on behalf of us and the Brookings Institution and the Center for the Study of Armed Groups at the Overseas Development Institute, I'd like to welcome you all to this discussion on the issue of how armed groups are responding to COVID-19. We have a really wonderful panel of experts with us today who've done years of field research in some of the most conflict-affected parts of the world. They've interviewed members of armed groups in Somalia, in Yemen, Nigeria, Afghanistan, Colombia, amongst others, and they can speak with real authority about the dynamics on the ground. And my job today is really to get out of the way as quickly as possible with minimal throat clearing and formalities and to let them speak. But I just want to make one point before we get started, and I might make this point a couple times. This is a webinar event, so you're an audience and we're speakers, but we really want to encourage a dialogue session after the presentations. And you're welcome to ask questions in the Q&A box, which you can find by clicking on it below. And I can read the questions to the panelists, but I'd prefer to add you as a participant briefly when we open up so that you can speak. So please do type your questions in at any time, and then I'll call on you to speak unless you specify that you want me to read your question. And my colleague, James Darnbrook, is standing by to help with any technical issues in doing that. We'll also record this and post this later on YouTube. So I actually want to jump straight into the speakers, and we've asked each of them to consider the questions: how have armed groups in a variety of countries or their countries of expertise responded to the pandemic? Have they instrumentalized the dynamics in any way, and what have been the impacts? And our first speaker is Dr. Vanda Felbat-Brown, who is the director at the Initiative on Non-State Armed Actors at the Brookings Institute. She's done some of the most interesting and empirically strong field work in a range of settings that I've seen, including in Somalia, Nigeria, Colombia, and elsewhere. And she'll speak today from her research. We'll also be sending some links to her work in the chat box below. So without further ado, please go ahead, Vanda. Thanks for joining.
Well, thank you so much, Adam, for suggesting that we do together this event. I'm thrilled to have this opportunity to speak with everyone and be joined by such excellent speakers, and look forward to our conversation. You mentioned the Brookings Initiative on Non-State Armed Actors that has about 5 key strands, and in one way or another, I'll touch on various of the key strands that we are exploring, examining, and developing policy suggestions from. But I will speak about what COVID has meant for non-state armed actors. But I would be remiss to do it without speaking about what COVID has meant for states. So let me give a broader overview of how COVID has changed the power dynamics and the strategic landscape between non-state armed actors and governments, and then look forward to my colleagues getting in far greater depth on any particular armed group. I think it's important to emphasize that the structural effects of COVID are far more potent than what a regional war would cause. At this point, we are in several million deaths of COVID. More than 60 million people have been infected. So simply the scale of death is far greater than what even a vicious regional war would bring about in less than a year. COVID has also decimated GDPs of governments across the world, whether we're talking Mexico, India, Latin America, Indonesia. We are seeing collapse of GDP on the order of 10%, 12%, 9%. Deep recession that has really not been seen in decades. In Colombia, we haven't seen such contraction in several decades. In Mexico, at least going to the tequila crisis. In India, at least going to 79. And we are still not out of the woods. COVID has also pushed at least 150 million people into extreme poverty. And I say at least, this number is old and comes from about June, and we know that the effects have been far more pronounced than when this number was established. So we're looking really at greater number actually than 150 million people pushed into extreme poverty, meaning living on less than $2 a day. And essentially, in less than 25 weeks, COVID has liquidated 25 years of anti-poverty reduction efforts. Now, it's also significant to think about how COVID has done that. So not only have people been pushed into extreme poverty, many have been pushed into extreme poverty in ways that demanded they liquidate all of their human development assets. And that is true not just for them, but also for their families, their children, and often many have been pushed into extreme, not just extreme poverty, but also illegal economies. The implication all of this is that even when economies start growing, once vaccines become distributed at sufficient levels, at sufficient numbers, many people will not be able to return from extreme poverty back into their status before COVID. They will stay there for years, perhaps decades, and perhaps for many of them, it will only be the next generation that will be able to come out. Moreover, many people who have been pushed into extreme poverty will have already ended up in the hands of non-state armed actors, whether they are criminal groups or they are insurgent and militant groups. They have become their only source of income, livelihoods, and perhaps to some extent a source of some provision of socioeconomic goods and public services. And I say to some extent because all non-state armed actors make a choice as to how they govern. Do they govern through brutality only, groups such as Boko Haram or Jalisco Nueva Generación cartel in Mexico, or do they also govern through the provision of services, such as the Islamic State in West Africa province, a splinter group from Boko Haram, or other entities? So they vary in the choices they made. I would also say that COVID has deeply exacerbated some of the underlying illicit economies that are the source of COVID and zoonotic pandemics to start with. So whether it's poaching, illegal logging, deforestation, illegal fires, none of these have eased during COVID. In fact, we are seeing the opposite. Both people, ordinary people, have been pushed into participating in them in what is the first migration out of urban areas into rural areas in decades in vast parts of the world, as well as by vested interest groups that have gained even greater leverage with governments. Vested interest groups being extractive industries, logging industries, that now sing the siren song to governments that they will be able to deliver income and GDP revenue at the time when everything else is contracting. So governments are highly susceptible because they lost spending capacity, because they have limited capacity to offset the economic effects, including socioeconomic effects of COVID. And one of the areas where, of course, governments will be affected deeply, are affected already, is money for law enforcement, for suppressing illicit economies. So it's both their will and their capacity to suppress non-state armed actors' illicit economies, maintain revenues for law enforcement or military forces that is challenged for many governments around the world. One implication being both for many governments, greater tendency toward brutality in responding toward non-state armed actors because they cannot deliver packages of effective law enforcement and socioeconomic benefits, as well as high susceptibility to co-optation deals, bargaining with non-state armed actors, and relegating rule and governance to them. So what have non-state armed actors done in this context? Well, just about around the world, they have used COVID to perpetuate the agenda that they have had to start prior to COVID. So if the group had a desire for a ceasefire for its own reasons pre-existing COVID, like the ELN did, the ELN, the leftist guerrilla armed group in Colombia, seemed to respond to the call of Secretary Gutierrez to a limited ceasefire for 1 month, and used it to strengthen control over local populations, to impose even deeper controls, prohibit travel, and strengthen its rule and its limitation of any kind of local opposition or other local voices. ISIS, on the other hand, ISIS and groups like Boko Haram, as well as Shabab, said, well, COVID is the act of Allah, against the Kafirs and appropriated the narrative agenda that this was punishment meant to destroy the West. Often dismissed, at least rhetorically, procedures that were necessary, such as social distances and masking, but also some of them interestingly evolved. So ISIS at the beginning, like Boko Haram, did not impose limitations on going to mosques, prayer, socializing, but quite rapidly did. Boko Haram did not. And however, at some point, several Boko Haram leaders got infected with COVID. And interestingly enough, the group was then willing to have at least some exchanges with humanitarian actors. There is also an interesting evolution with respect to Shabab that contemplated responding to Secretary General Gutierrez's call for ceasefire, rejected it, but at the same time robustly signaled to humanitarian groups that they will guarantee their access and they welcome their provision of anti-COVID responses. The Taliban acted in a similar way, but this was a big change for Shabab, who in 2011 rejected humanitarian responses with respect to the famine in Somalia at the time, and that's got severely hurt with respect to its political capital, legitimacy with local populations. In Mexico and Central America, the pandillas, maras, and the cartels reacted in similar ways. They often imposed their own lockdowns, which was quite striking at the time when governments in Central America and Mexico were flailing for response and dismissing the illness, and again used the lockdowns to strengthen control. But in Mexico, in particular, they also went far beyond that, distributing limited handouts of foods and sanitizers stamped with the brand of the particular cartel. And again, some interesting evolution there with Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, one of the two most powerful groups, which has up till now really chosen to rule through brutality, iber alles, be tougher, more brutal than anyone else on the block, and not seeking to deliver semi-public services, joining the bandwagon, and eventually, like Sinaloa Cartel, like the Gulf Cartel, like smaller groups, distributing packages with its own stamp on it. Finally, I want to make two last points in handing it over to my colleagues. One is that the broad utilization and capitalization on COVID is not something limited to fragile, unstable countries. We very robustly have seen it also in the West, across Western Europe and in the United States, with COVID being utilized by right-wing armed groups in the United States to recruit very aggressively online to promote accelerationist agendas which seek to instigate violence, to provoke a civil war in the United States. Lots of chatter online suggesting attacks against hospitals, suggesting attacks against police officers, law enforcement officers, synagogue, minority groups, to set off violent confrontations with both law enforcement as well as groups like Black Lives Matter. And ultimately, this then led to very active plotting of attacks, such as Governor Whitmer, and strong opposition to wearing of masks, lockdowns, and an active effort to build political capital with right-wing Republican politicians, whom the groups have presented themselves as their partners. The most important, of course, President Trump, but also lower level politicians across the country, but also to businesses where the various armed groups would show up in businesses and say, don't obey the lockdown, we will protect you, we will keep the cops away so you can keep your business running. Very purposeful agenda to build up broad political capital. My final comment here is that I started by saying that governments have long used non-state armed actors for governing. There have long been complex co-optations, deal, and complex bargaining with governments relying on non-state armed actors for votes, for rule, for extraction of resources, for targeting other rivals and enemies. COVID has reinforced that, deepened this dependence and this proclivity rather than weakened it. But it's also providing a very important opportunity for the geopolitical use of non-state armed actors by countries such as Iran and the various pro-Iranian militias that Iran has cultivated and robustly anchored across the wider Middle East, but also countries such as Russia and China. So the geopolitical dimension was not new, but again, like other dimension, has been reinforced by COVID. Thanks, Adam.
Thanks so much, Vanda. And that's such a useful kind of tour of all of the dynamics around the world. I hope we can circle back and also maybe think about some comparisons, the points you made about ISIS and Shabab, whether there's comparisons to be made with what Siobhan will say about Boko Haram. And I really appreciate the broad start we have. And I do hope we can circle back to that. Our next speaker is Nadwa Al-Dawsari. She's a non-resident fellow at the Middle East Institute, and she's the former Yemen country director at the Center for Civilians in Conflict. And I see some current and former members of Civic here, and I hope they jump in with questions for her. Nadwa has over 20 years of experience working in and researching Yemen and has published some of the most interesting work on the Houthi movement I've read. I'll send some links to some of her work about this. There's a very interesting one about the relationship between the Yemeni ceasefire and the risks of the pandemic that I'll send. But over to you, Nadwa, please.
Thank you very much for having me. Really good to be part of a discussion with such experienced group. So I'm going to be talking about the Houthis, and that's mainly because that's where all the action happened. That's where we saw a really solid example of how COVID was weaponized in the case of Yemen. So just to give a brief description of the Houthis, Houthis are an Iran-backed militia that overthrew the government and took control of the capital city of Sana'a in 2014. They are currently in control of North Yemen, where 70% of the population live. So basically, Houthis, they rule with terror. They rule with an iron fist. And COVID has basically reinforced that. So COVID was yet another opportunity for the Houthis to crack down on the people in the areas they control. And the way they responded to the disease was in different ways. Their first reaction was a complete information blackout. They denied any cases in their areas existed. They refused to share information about the disease with the WHO or anybody else. And even after reports came out of people dying in large numbers in Sana'a hospitals as a result of COVID-like symptoms, and even after there were videos of dead people buried secretly in the middle of the night and escorted by Houthi armed men so that nobody knows. They've also threatened health workers and grave diggers of severe punishment if they share any information about deaths and the disease. The response basically was more like criminalizing the disease. Suspected COVID patients were treated like criminals, basically. There were videos that activists share online of Houthi armed men evacuating patients with other, with Houthi escorts and Houthi basically shooting bullets in the air to intimidate residents in the neighborhood where they have suspected cases. All that while they still denied that any cases existed. But when they finally admitted that there were cases in their areas, they announced the first case, and they claimed the case was a Somali who came from government-controlled areas. Now, Houthis do not have, there's no access to Houthi-controlled areas except through government-controlled areas. That's because the coalition control all the seaports and the airports. And because they said the first case was a Somali, that that caused concerns among many that it would exacerbate the already racist attitude among some Yemenis towards African immigrants and Yemenis of African blood. Now, people who went to the hospital to seek help for COVID, many of them died right the day after they went to the hospital. And that created a wide perception among Yemenis that Houthis use injections to kill suspected COVID patients. And whether that's true or not, the way Houthis dealt with the disease and with the patients kind of reinforced that perception, and that led many to not seek help, or because of that, many were reluctant to seek help, and some died because they didn't want to go to the hospitals where they were, going to be put to sleep. It also they also tightened control of the entries to their areas. They blocked Yemenis coming from outside. Most of them were Yemenis who came from outside the country. That's basically how Yemenis travel to Houthi-controlled areas. They come from outside the country to airports that are controlled by the government, and then they take the road to their homes that are in Houthi-controlled areas. So they blocked travelers, and they kind of put them in schools and places, in crowded places, and absolutely no services, absolutely no water, and horrible, horrible conditions. But it was also at the same time, it was a great opportunity for them to extort some of these people, because people who paid money, who paid bribes, were allowed in without any test. The COVID-19 was also a great opportunity for Houthis to spread disinformation. And if you follow Yemen, like Iran, Houthis are very good at disinformation and misinformation. In this case, the Houthi leader himself, in a speech, said that the COVID-19 is an American Zionist biological weapon that's being used by the Americans and the Zionists for war. One, so that America creates a vaccine and profit from the vaccine, and two, so that America can weaken China economically. And also it was also an opportunity for Houthis to promote themselves. The Houthi Minister of Health came out and said the COVID vaccine will come out of Yemen, because Yemeni doctors are currently doing research and are about to come up with a vaccine. COVID-19 was also an opportunity for the Houthis to recruit. And they've done that systematically. And the way Houthis do recruit, one of the ways Houthis do recruitment is through media, social media. And I remember a Houthi leader came on TV, and he encouraged children and men to go and fight in the front lines instead of dying at home of COVID like chickens. Now, ironically, that same person died in his home like a chicken. So basically, again, COVID-19 was an opportunity for Houthis to tighten their grip over power, to crack down on other people, and to make some money, and also to spread disinformation that feeds into the political narrative that they've created to promote themselves locally, but also internationally. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nadwa. And I hope we can circle back, especially to that point about using it as a platform for recruitment, because I think there may be some comparisons across other groups and some lessons we can learn from that experience. And I just want to encourage people, there are a couple questions coming in, but you can type a question in the Q&A at any point and once we open up. So please do jump in and get yourself in the queue for that. Our third speaker is Dr. Ashley Jackson. She is the co-director of an exciting new think tank, the Center for the Study of Armed Groups within the Overseas Development Institute. And Ashley spent years living in Afghanistan, studying the Taliban and producing some of the most insightful analysis that I've seen about how the group has used the pandemic as a ladder, is the phrase she used, to gain influence in Afghanistan. And we're really lucky to have you here. Ashley, please go ahead.
Thank you, Adam, and thanks to Vanda and Nabwa who've set up where I'm going to go with this brilliantly. The Taliban is in many ways an opposite case to the Houthis in terms of at least their approach to COVID. And the story of the Taliban in Afghanistan during the pandemic tells a different kind of variant, I think, than we normally see in this broader story on COVID and armed groups. You know, at the outset of the pandemic, the Taliban was entrepreneurial. They seized upon COVID as a means to wage a communications battle, to embarrass the Afghan government. At the time, you know, you had the pandemic encroaching into Afghanistan, but not a lot of testing, not a lot of data. In Iran, however, we knew it was a huge problem. And migrant workers from Afghanistan were being sent back from Iran, crossing the border. The government in Kabul was struggling to figure out what to do. The Taliban swung into action, demanded that in all of the west of Afghanistan, where these individuals were going back home, that they should stay home for 2 weeks, avoid contact with their family. They called on their fighters to police those crossing the border. They said the border should be closed. Well, of course, it remained open. So they were really trying to look active and, you know, not exaggerate, but play up the risks of the pandemic to their advantage. But they go a little bit overboard in terms of PR. The Taliban has a well-established media commission and machinery around these things. And all of a sudden, their website and their Twitter feed are filled with statements and videos. There are videos of Taliban COVID squads in multiple languages, including English. They're sort of in spacesuits spraying down the streets and, you know, going up to people's homes, knocking on the door with a temperature gun, all these kinds of things. So the propaganda machine then kicks in. But it starts to get a little bit ridiculous. There's this one great story from Eastern Afghanistan where the Taliban gathers all the local journalists and gives them a briefing about COVID. And they have one of those very fancy thermometer guns and all this equipment, and all the guys are in PPE. And one of the journalists, you know, wanders up to the front of the room to the table to check out this fancy thermometer gun. But it turns out to be a piece of plastic and a piece of plywood, cleverly painted over and taped together, which I think it tells us something about how the Taliban has capabilities to coerce and to enforce, to spin propaganda, but not actually a force to deal with public health crisis. Even the government in Kabul has very limited capacity at this point to deal with a public health crisis. And so the Taliban sort of then walks this line of risking credibility by devoting all of these resources to fancy videos, but yet people don't see them actually doing anything on the ground. And even within the Taliban, there are varying attitudes. You know, reports emerge of people being stopped at Taliban checkpoints, as one is, crossing territory, and being told, you know, why are you wearing a mask? You know, Allah takes care of the faithful, so you won't get sick if you're a good Muslim. So it all starts to sort of become counterproductive in some ways for the Taliban, especially as the government tries to start to do things, especially as people actually start to get sick. But what eventually happens is that bigger concerns surface. And one of those bigger concerns is peace talks. While the Taliban make a big fuss about COVID initially, everyone really wants the Taliban to focus on dialogue. On February 29th, right before the pandemic really crests in Central Asia, the Taliban and the US sign a peace deal ending the US involvement in principle in the conflict, or at least laying out a roadmap to do so. This is supposed to trigger a number of steps: prisoner swap between the Taliban and the Afghan government, and then intra-Afghan negotiations between the government and the Taliban to actually end the war. I'm simplifying a bit here because I think that I could sort of spend an hour talking about this process if we had it. But all of this requires shuttle diplomacy and actual negotiations. This is a very complex, tentative, fragile, fraught process, and they can't just hit pause. All sides want this to move forward because the alternatives are worse. Of course, they're stalling on various issues, the prisoner exchange being one of them. But there's an interesting kind of transition that happens in this period. Initially, people are worried that COVID could become a spoiler in the talks. Like, what if, some of these older Taliban gentlemen on the negotiating team, what if they get sick? What if they die? What if there's a fracture in the chain of command? What if then, one side blames the other for infecting them? What if this is also an opportunity? The SG's call for a humanitarian ceasefire. Some diplomats seize on that and try and pressure the Taliban to yet again declare a humanitarian ceasefire. Of course, the Taliban does not budge. They don't buy this. This doesn't change their stance on anything. And all the while, diplomats and others are trying Zoom diplomacy, trying to do it remotely, trying to keep things on life support. And COVID, again, is just one of many factors in this process, which is threatening to drive it off the rails. But none of that lasts because you have to be there in person. And ultimately, you have to drive the process forward because there's this sort of all-consuming sense that no one can afford to slow down for too long. If it falls apart, Trump pulls US forces from Afghanistan without any kind of roadmap or peace agreement. Afghanistan without a peace accord is an absolute disaster. And in comparison, COVID doesn't look like such a big deal because that would be so much more catastrophic. So eventually things with some measure of precaution still move forward, take place, and you kind of see people acclimate and not really think it's a very big deal. In some senses, intra-Afghan negotiations start in September. Nobody's talking about COVID at that point. People are wearing masks, but not all of them. You see kind of people acclimating again to these challenges. 3 quick points in conclusion. I think part of this is down to the nature of the pandemic, both globally as a public health threat, but also in countries like Afghanistan. So it's a slow burn, which means that in many conflict contexts, it just is so much less visible, particularly when you have incredibly high levels of daily violence, displacement, all of these other threats to your life and well-being. And it's not something like the Indian Ocean tsunami or Ebola, where it might really sort of jar people immediately into this sort of moments of opportunity. And it makes it less attractive as a wedge issue for an insurgency like the Taliban to kind of hang on to. Compounding that, when you have a lack of public health infrastructure, I think there was like a dozen ventilators in Kabul at the onset in Somalia and other places. There were 2 in Somalia. So if you can't offer treatment or force people to stay at home and also provide some social protection so they don't starve, then everyone, including the Taliban, has to sort of get on with their lives. And so maybe it isn't this all-consuming political issue as it is for most of us in Europe and the US. One last point is that, of course, COVID is a multi-dimensional crisis, which Venda touched on very well in the beginning, and there are economic consequences. So I think what you see is the economic consequences, at least in Afghanistan, aren't particularly straightforward. It isn't that the Taliban has been able to use this to drive recruitment so much. It's not that people fall into poverty and join the insurgency to make ends meet or because they're frustrated. It's a domino falling, of which some effects are foreseeable and some are not. The more foreseeable effects, and what we're seeing so far, has really hit the government harder. It's created an $8 million fiscal hole. It's increased poverty rates. Before the pandemic, just over half of the population was living in poverty. Now I think it's above 2/3, which is shocking to think about. And the worst part is that this is happening at a time where donors are facing their own economic hits and budget cuts, which severely limits their willingness to devote aid to a country like Afghanistan. when it really needs it the most. And the way that will play out with the Taliban, it's not as much of a concern. But I'll leave it there and hand it back to Adam.
Thanks so much, Ashley. And I can probably see Vanda getting ready to have some additional points on this, because you both cover the Taliban, and I think it's a really interesting point you make also about some of the counterproductive efforts that they've done and how it may have backfired. I also hope we can circle back to this SG's call for a ceasefire, because it's been mentioned a couple of times, and what impact it might have. Our final speaker is Dr. Siobhan O'Neill. She's the project director in the Managing Exits from Armed Conflict project at UN University Center for Policy Research, where I also work. Siobhan is currently running a large in-country project in Nigeria, examining the reintegration processes for people formerly associated with Boko Haram and other armed groups. And I think what's especially exciting from her work is that she's been running pretty large-scale surveys in northern Nigeria right now, which have produced some new understandings about the dynamics there, how armed groups are operating, the perceptions. And so I think it's really exciting to have kind of current ground truth information coming in. And so please, over to you, Siobhan.
Thanks, Adam. And thank you to all the panelists for really setting this up really nicely. I think there's been amazing examples that give you sort of the spectrum of how armed groups are taking advantage or instrumentalizing the uncertainty and the disruption that has happened with the pandemic. And obviously this is not unusual in the sense that armed groups always take advantage of disruption and uncertainty. And this is just another case of how they try to enhance their appeal, critique their enemies, recruit, mount kinetic operations in the disruption, and move into spaces where the state might be absent. And that's certainly what's happening in Northeast Nigeria, where we're running one of our large-scale studies. So I'll just run through a couple practical examples of what we're seeing, and then I'll give you a hint of some of the data we are collecting in real time. And I've just been online refreshing to see what new responses have come in today. They're still pretty small numbers, so these are just hints, but I think they're indicative and quite interesting. We launch a 3,000 person survey on Saturday in the Maiduguri and Jere areas of the Northeast. And I think we're going to start to see even more interesting information on this, because we're collecting information on how Boko Haram and other armed groups are using the pandemic. So just to say that in April, as the Northeast started to lock down, you have a message that comes out, an audio recording from Shekau, the factional leader of Boko Haram, where I think he tries to accomplish sort of three things. And Vanda already mentioned one of them. And one is to reinforce their ideological message of the group, and that the reason we're seeing the pandemic is because of the evil deeds of certain people. And so this is something that different types of groups do pretty frequently. It's not that unusual. So we see that kind of reinforcement happening. What's also quite interesting is there is this promotion of another way of life in comparison to what the government is sort of authorizing or allowing. And so some of the comments in this audio tape are, we pray 5 times a day, we pray shoulder to shoulder. And here you have the government closing mosques and telling you can't follow your faith rigorously. And he said, we're immune. So here is this sort of introduction of this idea that followers have this sort of added benefit and this immunity to the pandemic that others who aren't adhering to their ideology sort of lack. And I think there's also a really important piece here is that they're offering a life, a way of life, a social life that everyone else is being restricted from. And that appeal, particularly to young people, is probably quite powerful. My colleague Katja van Berkoven and I have written on this particular issue around young people. And I'm sure you're all seeing in your own lives the intergenerational conflict that's happening around this pandemic. You may have parents you're trying to get to change their behavior, or young people in your life that you're trying to get to change their behavior. And there is this frustration from young people that they're giving up a lot. And as the first ones hired, first ones fired, or sorry, last ones hired, first ones fired sort of thing, they're really suffering in the Corona economy. So this message might be particularly appealing and crafted to appeal to young people who are suffering from that lack of social mobility and engagement. And another one is just very specific to pull this through is the critique of the government, right? So the government is curtailing faith. And so that has been sort of a message that's been long running, but it's something to very specifically emphasize. This is the reason you can't go on the Hajj. This is the reason why you can't go to mosque. And we would not allow that to happen. So the question is, how is this message being interpreted? We have one survey that's been running for 3 weeks and we're just getting data in. So we have 107 community leaders as of 10 minutes ago, and surveys with them about how their communities have been impacted on this particular issue. And it's interesting and positive to see that overwhelmingly the dominant messages they're hearing about the coronavirus are from the central government, from the Borno state government, from local leaders, from international organizations, some of which are on the line today. So that's great. A few of them did admit to hearing messages from Boko Haram and ISWAP, nothing from Ansara, which is interesting, and along the lines of what we just heard. So either the coronavirus is not real, it's an attack by the West, or the government's really inept in its response to the pandemic. So while very small numbers admit to hearing these messages, everyone seems fairly aware of how Boko Haram, the various factions have tried to instrumentalize and use the pandemic to make gains. And so obviously one of the biggest ones is a real marked increase in attacks. That's about 50% of people that we're hearing. And that's quite obvious why. So you have in March, the end of March, 2 of the largest attacks on the same day against the military in Chad and against the Nigerian military almost simultaneously. And April that month, the next month, becomes the 3rd deadliest month in attacks by Boko Haram and related factions since the insurgency began. And the other 2 months were from when it was at its absolute height. So I think that's quite telling that this is very apparent to everyone. But it's also clear that other messagings are coming through, even if people don't admit to sort of hearing those messages. And there's a sizable proportion of people who talk about how they're trying to discredit the government in all of this. And how they're offering social interaction in a way that the government says is prohibited. So I think that's important. The other one that's really interesting is a very small percentage of people say that Boko Haram is specifically offering public health services. Now that's interesting because, as Vanda mentioned, we don't really think about Boko Haram as a service providing organization, but some of our early data suggests that community leaders who were occupied at one time or another do identify different types of services. Mostly around security or providing money and loans, things like that, and education, obviously, or a version of education. But there was a small percentage, about 12% of people highlighted medical care and specifically coronavirus protections that were being offered by Boko Haram and related factions when they occupied communities. So that's kind of an interesting sort of development on that front. I'll just leave with a couple just sort of potential impacts and why this is important in Nigeria. Obviously, anything that allows a group to enhance their stature and promote the narrative, critique the government, those are all important things, particularly around young people. I think that's a really important one to think about how young people are being impacted by the pandemic. And if there are groups who appear to be offering them something that no one else can in this time, that's an important thing, I think, for all of us to sort of wake up to. Another thing that's particularly important, I think, in the Northeast is how much the messaging by armed groups here might be contributing to conspiracy theories, which are quite rampant in this part of Nigeria, around the conflict particularly, and the impact that might have on long-term public health responses by the government and international organizations. So while many of the people that we have interviewed agree overwhelmingly that the coronavirus is real, 60% think they're already immune to it. And 50% think it was an orchestrated attack by foreign countries. This has led, and there's just recent survey data not done by us, but opinion surveys, Nigeria has the highest rate in the world by some orders of magnitude of believing that fatality rates around coronavirus are grossly exaggerated. So there's a lot of concern about what the sort of messaging is here, and that has implications for, I think, public health response. And the other one is they are the second highest in the world, behind South Africa, where there's a lot of sort of medical myths that perpetuate in this space about concern about vaccines. And so one of the things, there's a lot of research that's going on now about sort of willingness to accept vaccines, but that's particularly a challenging thing for the Northeast to sort of move on from this pandemic and address the public health concerns when there's so much skepticism, and that skepticism is increasingly being fueled by armed groups as well. So I'll stop it there, but I think there's a lot to sort of open the floor and have a rich conversation about, and I welcome it. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Siobhan. You gave us a lot to think about there. And I think especially that issue around Boko Haram offering public health services and playing a kind of governance role. I'm sure Ashley's written quite a bit about the governance role of the Taliban. There may be some comparisons there. And I really like the point about conspiracy theories and longer term impacts. I think we're all starting to think about vaccines now too, so I'm glad that you brought that into play. We're going to open up now, and I encourage you all to use the Q&A to put any questions. We do have some questions. James is going to add Piotr and Marilyn, and then Marco will speak, and I will read another question from Edward. So as James is adding them so that they can speak, I just wanted to kind of slightly abuse the moderator role and put a couple other questions in also, and panelists, you can choose whichever ones you like, and I hope you also provoke each other a bit. We touched on this a bit, but one of the questions I have is really, has the SG's global call for a ceasefire around the pandemic had an impact? Siobhan talked about an increase in attacks. Ashley mentioned the ceasefire in terms of the Taliban peace process. Nadwa spoke of it too, though it appears it hasn't really held up in Yemen. So that kind of, if you could comment a bit more on the ceasefire. The second one is about Vanda's point on geopolitics. Has COVID shifted anything regionally that might affect peace processes? Do you see openings or closures? And that leads to a kind of final question I'd have, which is, are there lessons we can learn, not in terms of just what the armed groups are doing, but as peacemakers, can you instrumentalize COVID? And I remember having a conversation with Mara Revkin, who mentioned that in Iraq they were doing pretty large scale prisoner releases because of COVID, and that could open up a different dynamic on a peace process in Iraq with people being let go and potentially looking at amnesties or legal leniency. So those are my questions, but I wanted to turn the mic over to Piotr, who I think has now been added, and then after that we'll have Marilyn and Njoroge speak as well. Go ahead, Piotr.
Good afternoon, good morning. Thank you very much, but I feel that I'm probably not the best place to be asking questions or contributing too much, as I've only just graduated university, and so I'm here mainly to learn from those much more experienced and insightful than myself. So I don't have anything at this moment to contribute of much substance, so I hand it over to whoever would like to speak next. Thank you, though.
I'll read your question then, because it's an interesting one. You said,
oh, okay. Sorry, my question disappeared, so I couldn't see it. Apologies.
I'll read it for you. You said you'd be interested to hear how armed groups or militants may try to exploit the effects of COVID-19 to reignite conflicts in areas which have been stabilized but remain tense, and it wouldn't take much to deteriorate there. So kind of, is there a potential kind of escalatory aspect of it that we haven't really looked at? I don't know if Marilyn is here. Please go ahead. You have the floor.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much, Adam. And thanks to all the panelists who made presentations. It was very interesting. So my question was basically if the panelists could give some specific examples of how armed groups have denied access to humanitarian organizations that are offering assistance, especially on COVID. I think the lady who presented on Yemen may have mentioned a few things, but if there are any other examples, that would be good. Also, if there are examples, then what was the outcome and how was the government involved? So maybe that would also touch on, relations with armed actors and government, armed forces. It's always a tricky situation, but yeah, if you could also speak to that. Thank you.
Thanks, Marilyn. That's a great question. I'm going to read one more and then turn it back over to the panel. We've got a few more trickling in. This is a bit of a long one from Edward Newman, but I'll get through it. he said, it's interesting to consider and learn the lessons where COVID-19 has worked in favor of state actors against insurgents. In the case of Northeast India, the epidemic saw the strength, local legitimacy, territorial control, ability to recruit, and financial health of insurgent groups significantly decline in 2020. And this has reduced the capacity of insurgent groups to undertake military activities and challenge state authorities. The insurgency groups were already on the decline historically, but it's been accelerated by the pandemic. He's got some longer points there too, but I think that's interesting to think of rather than instrumentalizing positive, potentially the limiting effects that it may have on armed groups. So I'm going to turn it back over to the panel, and hopefully James can mute whoever's mic has come back on here. And maybe I'll start, Vanda, you mentioned that you wanted to come in on something specific to some of the other presentations. So I'll start with Vanda, and then I'll do Siobhan, Ashley, Nadwa. Go ahead, Vanda.
Thanks, Adam. I want to mention on Nigeria and the notion that Boko Haram is providing public health services being very interesting if it is indeed Boko Haram. And Shaban mentioned Boko Haram and associated factions, where I would challenge that the factions are in fact associated. The reason why there is not more active violence between ISWAP, the eastern branch of Boko Haram, and the Shekau faction is because of the heavy lifting that the Islamic State did in trying to mitigate more outright warfare. And when ISWAP split off and declared its own faction, it's particularly specialized in ruling much more gently, being much more discriminating in attacks, not deploying attacks on Muslims, letting even police officers, giving them warning, but not necessarily killing them first outright, and delivering public health services. Islam was the first group that 3-4 years ago started bringing pregnant women to clinics and hospitals. Sometimes they never experienced from either Boko Haram or the government or Bulama or anyone else. So it would be interesting to see whether the reporting is about ISWAP that's bunched with Boko Haram, or whether it is about the Shekau faction, which would have significantly learned and adjusted the strategy. That leads me to, I think it was Robert, Mr. Newman's comment that some groups are weakened. And of course, that's not surprising. I would say the only thing that's surprising is that so few groups are weakened by COVID. But some of the pandillas and maras in Central America, in places like Panama, not just El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, are also weakened. Not all the big ones necessarily, because they have less capacity to extort. Groups that participate in robust labor-intensive illicit economies have benefited and have the greatest resilience as well as greatest capacity for political capital. But groups that live on hand-to-mouth extortion, like some of the smaller gangs in Mexico or some of the pandillas in places like Panama or the Northern Triangle, have been hit very, very hard. They cannot extort, they are weaker. I would, however, caution that this means that necessarily that this is the end of them. I mean, these effects are temporal and they're changing. And I think we have to be careful about making assumptions that weakening means demise. That might well be the case in some groups. And in fact, the groups vary in their capacities, in their smarts, in their brains, in their capacity to adjust and adopt, and groups get destroyed. They get destroyed by each other. They get destroyed by wrong strategic decision they get destroyed by internal infighting, which I would say it's another interesting effect of COVID that we have not seen, that I had anticipated to be more robust than we have in fact seen. I expected that a good number of leaders would die, particularly leaders in prisons, such as PCC and CV leadership in Brazil. They were highly vulnerable, and that this would set off internal factionalization. And we haven't seen it very robustly. Every so often, some in the Taliban got infected, some Boko Haram lieutenants got infected and perhaps even died, but we haven't seen big factionalization. My final comment would be on the geopolitical issue that was raised. But I think there are two ways that geopolitics is now playing into COVID. One is China has expanded its efforts to promote its way of policing very intensely in East Asia. And we haven't talked about groups in East Asia, and particularly groups in slums, groups like the Islamic State up in Southeast Asia. We haven't really talked about that, but China is very aggressively promoting its highly militarized, highly tight fist way of promoting in East Asia, but it's also promoting it in Latin America. And it's supplementing it with highly intrusive surveillance technologies, such as smart cities, so-called smart cities apps, telling governments, look, your police forces are weak, you don't have the money. Here we can give you law enforcement anti-crime technologies that will crack down against the criminals that you have been struggling. And I'm very concerned about this leading to further authoritarianism, further militarization of policing. Russia, on the other hand, is doing the opposite. While China is trying to furbish government with more effective means of law enforcement repression, China has very actively instigating itself into a variety of protests, street unhappiness, anti-COVID protests, and use them to sow discord and to capitalize on generating disquiet, inserting itself into protests in Colombia, into protests in Ecuador, in Chile, creating a weakness from which it can exploit, as well as in some places like in Africa, then in this context of weakness, telling governments that it can furbish their survival by the use of groups like the Wagner Group and other non-state armed actors that are linked to the Russian state.
That's really fascinating, Beta, and I really appreciate the regional dynamics. It's so complex that you're able to unpack it. Siobhan, I think some of the questions touched on your work as well, so we'll turn to you now if that's okay.
Sure, and just to kind of throw it back towards you, Adam, I think on the humanitarian access, some of our colleagues and you are dealing with a project right now, so I don't know if you want to talk about that, and Najwa is better positioned on that issue than I am. I'll just make two comments on the other two questions. One is on if any of this sort of escalates conflict in some conditions. I think certainly when armed groups, whether their response maybe overlaps with cleavages, right, and helps kind of exacerbate them. So if again, the narrative is about kind of secular versus religious and the restrictions around the pandemic kind of play right into that and facilitate that narrative, you could see how that could escalate. Or if in the response, certain ethnic groups are supported and others aren't, you can see how some of these cleavages might be exacerbated. So that's kind of a hypothetical response to your question. And I think on the one, on the counterexample of how the pandemic could strengthen state support, legitimacy, and maybe even reach, I think that's really interesting. And it's interesting to think about in this particular moment compared to others, right? How armed group responses sort of resonate with populations. So if you have a critique of the government's not doing a good job in protecting the community against coronavirus, the critique may resonate because people are unhappy with what's going on, but at some point, can you offer an alternative? Are you providing services? Do you have something that's superior? The pandemic is interesting because it's quite invisible in many cases, right? And this is one of the challenges with it. When you're dealing with an earthquake and you have collapsed buildings, it becomes much more apparent much more quickly whether or not you are fulfilling the role of the state if you are providing services. When it comes to the pandemic, and it's quite invisible and you have a lot of disagreement and people aren't even recognizing it's a problem or they're denying it's an issue, do armed groups have more room to maneuver in that space? And those critiques, while not sort of stepping up to the plate themselves, can get you a little further. So I think it's interesting to think about the sort of specific moment we're in and what that allows groups to do, and maybe get more bang for their buck with very little sort of input. So I think that's just sort of one unique element to highlight. Thank you.
That is really interesting, Siobhan. I'm sure others will go on to comment on that issue as well. Ashley, did you want to come in on any of those questions? Some of them did seem potentially touching on the Taliban.
Sure. I mean, I think Siobhan makes a great point in terms of that it is this sort of nebulous, hidden thing, which manifests very differently in different places. And a lot depends, I think, on local perceptions of what the pandemic was and what armed groups or other political actors can sort of grab onto and magnify. And certainly you've seen that with gangs in Central and South America, as well as, more traditional insurgencies like the Taliban, like al-Shabaab. But I think what pandemics tend to do is accelerate certain trends, right? And that's a very easy sort of thing to throw out there as like conventional wisdom, but we don't really know which trends they're gonna accelerate. But what I think they also allow both states and armed groups to do is to become inherently much more coercive, to really crack down on things and have, not as though they needed much help. I mean, we've talked about the Houthis, the Taliban, other groups that are known for their brutality and their coercion. But this gives them a new angle, a new justification. And what I think was interesting about Marilyn's question about denial of humanitarian access, which I'm sure that's a whole session in and of itself, but is the sort of nebulous ways that manifested, whether it was closing borders to ostensibly stem the tide of the pandemic, but also limiting the movement of people who needed to flee dangerous situations. Whether it was armed groups sort of cracking down on aid agencies or healthcare workers, or seeing them as suspects and scapegoating them. And we saw that in a number of armed conflicts and quote unquote criminal contexts as well. So it wasn't, I think with humanitarian access, one of the interesting things to look at is it wasn't up and down kind of denial. It was opportunistic denial in many cases, or de facto denial because of all of the restrictions that were being put in place, and humanitarian access wasn't the overriding consideration. The last thing I wanted to touch on was, Adam, you said something about the SG's ceasefire call. And I was immediately very skeptical, but my view, but I was also seeing that through the lens of the countries I work on most, where I didn't see this being something that would gain traction for various reasons. But I think in retrospect, the interesting thing to look at is that a ceasefire call like that takes so much multilateralism, takes so much of a shared sense of purpose. And it occurred at just the moment where countries were turning inwards, even more so than we can say in the past, that they were focused on closing their borders, getting a vaccine for themselves, limiting all of these kinds of things, and more concerned about their own issues than, for example, trying to shore up dialogue in Mali, or trying to contribute to this broad call. And I think even where you saw, as in Myanmar and a couple of other countries, armed groups seeing this as like, okay, we can declare a ceasefire and get the peace talks that we want. Like, this is a great opportunity. And then, the government didn't reciprocate, or something went off the rails, and there wasn't enough collective political will to really use the opportunity that the SG's call provided. That is a gross generalization, and that may not be true everywhere, but I think that is one of the tricky things about such an opportunity, is that there are so many factors that work against actually diverting your attention from your own crisis to someone else's in this kind of moment. But I'll leave it there and hand it back to Nadwa.
Thank you. There was a question about whether COVID impacted peace or conflict in Yemen, and it did. And early this year, when stories about COVID, the spread of COVID came out, the UN and the international community and humanitarian organizations in Yemen were very, very concerned, because this is a country where 2/3 of the population are, in need of immediate assistance or protection. The health system is collapsed, and 70% of Yemeni people do not have access to drinking water. So there was a lot of pressure from the UN on the Saudis, who are backing the Yemeni government that are in fight with the Houthis, on the Houthis to initiate a ceasefire, so that the priority shifts towards addressing COVID, the spread of COVID, instead of the fighting. So there was a lot of pressure on the Houthis and on Yemeni government and on the Saudis to do a ceasefire. Now, the Houthis took that opportunity and escalated their offensive, taking large swaths of land east of the capital, and are currently threatening the last stronghold of the government in an attempt to strengthen their position, their ground military position, so that they have a stronger say on the table before a ceasefire actually happens. So it did, it affects conflict in that way. And if the Houthis manage to take this last government stronghold, it will have detrimental impact on potential for peace in the future.
Thanks so much, Nadwa. I think we had a few more questions. I think we have time for probably one more round, and I'm starting to see maybe the potential to link up some of the comments that you made. We did have Marco, but I think he just got cut out. If he comes back in, I'll add him. But we have a comment from Nicholas Gonzalez, who I think is being added now. Nicholas, please go ahead.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you, colleagues, the presenters. That was a fascinating discussion. I guess I have a very general question, but I'd like to know what your expectations are about this dynamic that you just described in this different context on the distribution of vaccines, of COVID-19 vaccines. How do you see that evolving? And I mean, we know that's going to be problematic, but do you see any lessons learned that can be useful to think through when imagining this process that will come at some point, probably next year? Thank you.
That's an interesting kind of forward-looking question. Bukia Kistemacher had a question, but has a sore throat, so I'm going to read it. Wrote, I was wondering if in your research an effect on defection or fracturing within armed groups due to COVID-19 has become apparent, and if so, why? That's an interesting question. And then, sorry, I'm kind of scrolling between these questions. Piotr had typed a couple other questions. Interested to know what the panelists think the pandemic as a transnational issue. Could it push more terrorist groups or non-state actors to build more networks between each other? And then another one about whether there is a greater role of women in developing effective responses to these challenges. And I'm just seeing, I think there was one more. I think those were the questions that were typed in. If I missed one, please let me know on the chat, but I think I've got them all now. And I think Vanda also, and all the panelists actually, but also it'd be interesting to think outside of the countries that we've looked at, some of the kind of current events. So Nagorno-Karabakh, Ethiopia, some of the, maybe even Venezuela, some of the places that are kind of high on the international radar. What do we think is going to happen in the near future there? How do we think the responses might be shaped by COVID? Some of the future pointing, but also kind of headline ones I'd be interested in hearing about. And I think we've got just enough time to do kind of one more round of responses. And I think I'm going to do the order in the opposite way as before. So Nadwa, if you have anything more to add also, if there are any kind of final points you'd make from the Yemen standpoint, we'd love to hear them. We'll go Nadwa, Siobhan, Ashley, and then Vanda.
I mean, in terms of how Yemenis responded to COVID, I would say, apart from armed groups, Yemenis pretty much made peace with the disease. So there was no real lockdown or observing social distancing or any of these factors. And I think that kind of, I'm sorry, I think there was a question about, a question about the role of women, if women develop effective responses to the challenge.
Yeah.
And I think in the case of Yemen, women are responsible for the home. They're responsible for the cleaning. They're responsible for educating the children, especially now that a lot of children are in school. So they do play an important role in that sphere. Outside that, a lot of women groups were involved in, campaigns, online campaigns, also ground campaigns among IDPs and others, educating people on how to help prevent, the spread of the disease. And I don't have any data, but I know that women groups and women were very involved, both in their home sphere, but also in the public sphere in different capacities.
Great, thanks so much. That's an interesting point, and I wonder if others will come up with similar ones in their countries. Now I've forgotten who's next. Siobhan, I think you're next.
Thank you, and sorry, I hope my internet doesn't go out. I'm having some trouble. I just think I'll touch on two. One, just to say, Piotr, I think it's a really interesting idea, as everybody else is being told to sort of downsize or contain their bubble, this idea that maybe armed groups are expanding theirs. I haven't followed that as closely, and if there's been a direct sort of effort to take advantage of this moment, but I think it's an interesting question. And the other thing I'll just say about vaccines, which I think is relevant to Northeast Nigeria, but probably everywhere, and it's not really from my work, I think it's from the work of like medical anthropologists and the work on sort of what sometimes are called medical myths, but that they're important to take into account, right? So you can design the best public health campaign, but if you don't recognize sort of what the prevalent sort of myths and narratives are around some of these things, you won't have an impact. And I think we've seen that in bird flu, we've seen that in HIV responses. So again, there are people with far more expertise than I, but I do think the role that armed groups are playing in this and the narratives that are becoming sort of commonplace will be essential to do a proper public health vaccination campaign.
Thanks so much, Siobhan. That's a really interesting point we should think of as terms of like a policy response, potentially. Ashley, you're up.
Yeah, I guess I have a couple of responses and closing thoughts. Absolutely, what Nadwa said about women's role, I mean, often in most societies it's in the domestic sphere, it's to clean, it's to take care of things. And of course, there's been a lot of headlines and a lot of research about this in more developed countries, but they also bear the brunt of societal frustrations and restrictions and uncertainty, most often in the form of domestic violence. In Afghanistan, there are a number of women's organizations trying to track how, or were at the beginning of the pandemic, how lockdowns in particular would exacerbate what is already an endemic problem. But given the lack of data and the lack of the ability to really do surveillance, such as it is on these issues, women don't go to the police. They don't have anyone to go to often to report what's happening to them or what's getting worse, but has been happening to them for a long time. And I think that's, there are many epidemics in this big one, but I would assume that's also something which we haven't talked enough about and which there hasn't been enough work on or understanding of, but certainly we know through common sense is there. I think also it's sort of interesting to think about. I ended what I said in the beginning on, all these economic effects had hit the Afghan government harder than they had hit the Taliban, and that's where I left us. But I think there's something else to sort of say about the economic contraction and the inward looking of donors and peacemakers and the nation states and institutions and organizations that will have to make cuts. I mean, ICRC even recently announced cuts which I think were long in the works, but it just sort of shows us that there's contracting resources to sort of deal with issues around peace, conflict, security, and that they'll likely be more scarce than when it comes to, for example, funding the peace process, if it, inshallah, moves forward or continues to move forward in Afghanistan. Then what? Donors are talking about sort of aid packages and peace dividends, and as much as I don't really buy into the logic of those, in countries like Afghanistan, Yemen, Somalia, elsewhere, what will be the long-term effects that are very indirectly linked to COVID, but really will have been driven by this shift that the pandemic set in motion? I think that, as well as some of the vaccine issues as well, are things we need to be thinking about next.
Thanks so much, Ashley. While you were speaking, I was thinking about the class that I teach at Columbia, where you were the guest speaker, and this idea of, can you use a moment like this to get leverage in a peace process and move a peace process forward rather than just treating it as a risk? And I see you continually kind of returning to the peace process as the main game. It's really interesting to think how that might play a role in the medium term. Vanda, you have the last word. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Let me start with some general observations and then go to some of the specific questions. Ashley said something that I think is quite fundamental, namely that most of the time, most non-state armed actors use COVID to do precisely what they had wanted to do before COVID. They did not really alter their strategies. So when groups like ELN seem to respond to the Secretary General's call for a ceasefire and adopted their 1-month ceasefire, which they have tried to resurrect later on in the summer, they did so because it had benefited them and because they had tried to do something like this beforehand. The Colombian government incidentally did not respond, nor did other of the very many armed groups in Colombia. So to me, whether it's conflict in Somalia, behavior of various militias or Shabab, the dynamics in Mexico, which is more violent, continually more violent, not in any way altered by COVID. Essentially, the trends are use COVID to do what you had wanted to do. So to me, the most interesting question is, to what extent are there groups that did something different, that altered their strategic calculation, either both at the strategic level or at least at the tactical level? And at least to the extent that I am aware, I have seen changes only at tactical level, such as Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación for the first time getting into distribution of socioeconomic handouts, but not altering its bipolar war with the Sinaloa cartel that runs from Mexico all the way to Colombia. We can talk about some other groups. And so, that's one of the things to watch in the agenda. Are there groups that altered their strategic agenda as a result of COVID? And if so, why? I want to come in on a few of the questions. The issue of women, let me expand that into a broader issue of marginalized groups and point out that many marginalized groups were more marginalized and ostracized and abused as a result of COVID. Whether this is further rise of the use of COVID to generate attacks on Muslims in India, not just from Hindu right groups like RSS and even some other more extreme versions, but even Indian health minister specifically laying the blame on Muslims gathering in mosques as spreader of COVID, or whether this is the abuse that migrant workers from Nepal, Philippines, the Horn of Africa face in places like Saudi Arabia and UAE. Even more ostracized, lockdown, abused as a result of COVID, or in the United States, the Trump administration using COVID as an excuse for immediate deportations of undocumented migrants, denial of any kind of asylum process, far greater, even denial of proper conditions for children by placing them in hotels at the border and deporting them as rapidly as possible. I think the issue of vaccines is a very interesting one, and I would make 2 points there. The first point is that in the distribution of vaccine, there will need to be significant need for negotiation of access with non-state armed groups. And this will be challenging internationally. On the one hand, there are many precedents, whether it's polio, acting against polio and operating in Pakistan, Nigeria, or Afghanistan. But on the other hand, the international legal regime significantly penalizes the delivery of material support to both groups that are labor terrorists, but also other specially designated groups, such as the Maras in Central America. So there will be potentially real tensions between the groups wanting some piece of the action as a result of allowing access and the legal prohibition against that. And yet, global public health, including very narrow self-interested interest of countries like the United States. So I think there's something to watch is those legal tensions, and there might need to be at least informal waivers of not prohibiting material support in the same way that those prohibition hampered access in 2011 in Somalia that exacerbated the deaths by at least 100,000 people. The second element of vaccines that will be interesting is, of course, the proliferation of fake vaccines and non-state armed actors like various mafia groups in Italy, as well as Turkish organized crime groups across Europe, but even actors in China promoting fake vaccines and selling fake vaccines cheaply, and the need to act against that. And that's, of course, linked to TCM, the traditional Chinese medicine, which the government of China has already strongly embraces and supports, and has already been exporting to countries like Afghanistan, Pakistan, saying something made out of horns of an antelope like Saiga will cure COVID without proof. On the issue of the expansion of networks, we saw it quite robustly with respect to the right-wing armed groups in the United States and Europe, where there have been contacts before, but COVID really accelerated and thickened the level of exchanges between neo-Nazi anti-migrant groups in places like Germany, France, and US right-wing armed groups, with fixed exchanges of ideas, how to use COVID, how to mobilize, appropriation of tactics, a lot of networking going on, not necessarily to join into any kind of synchronized attacks, but a lot of learning from each other and exchange in the right-wing armed groups space. I spoke about defections and splintering not really happening very much. I expected that we would see more of that as older leadership would die, and we haven't seen that really happening. Many leaders of non-state armed groups did not die, and we haven't seen really much splintering. And finally, just one word on Venezuela. I said that in the chat that not just armed groups, but states have also taken advantage of COVID, with Azerbaijan finally launching a war that it's been gearing up for many years, but finally making it happen as the world is preoccupied with COVID and its attention is diverted elsewhere to either freeze the frozen conflict and retake Nagorno-Karabakh. Certainly in Ethiopia, the government of Prime Minister Abiy, not being deterred by COVID or concerned about COVID, and launching a military response against the TPLF, the Tigray leadership, in response to its behavior, and significantly exacerbating dire humanitarian situation in northern Ethiopia, Sudan, and Eritrea as a result of that war. In Venezuela, that will be my last comment, there were, I think, questions and perhaps some hopes that COVID might weaken the regime of Maduro, and that hasn't really happened. Although COVID has been catastrophic for Venezuela, further limited access to food, employment, any kind of income for already terribly abused and deprived population, we have not seen that translating into any weakening of the regime. If anything, both domestically and internationally, the Maduro regime today is stronger than a year ago. The Guaido opposition has really fizzled out. The militias, the pro-Maduro militias, are still hanging in with him, arbitrating access to food and any kind of remaining medication. The difference, or the one effect of COVID, has been that Venezuelan people have used Colombia as a way to provide for basic livelihoods, and COVID shut that down and prevented it temporarily. So we saw vast movements of people out of Colombia back into Venezuela, vast numbers of Venezuelan refugees in Colombia heading back into Venezuela as opportunities, employment, access to food really collapsed in Colombia as a result of DAN, one of the most severe in Latin America. Then falling back into Venezuela, finding nothing, even more crushing conditions, and heading back into Venezuela. So the people have been really deprived, hammered, and are in very bad situation, but the regime is stronger.
Thanks so much, Vanda. And sometimes when I listen to you, I imagine the articles that you're about to write almost moving directly from your comments onto the page. It's so impressive. And I was also thinking your point about kind of the right-wing militias maybe becoming better networked. I wonder if there's a broader kind of Zoom effect of COVID, which has deepened a lot of networking and created maybe even more vibrant echo chambers of hypernationalism maybe, or ideology that we might look back on and say this was a longer term effect. I want to just close this event with two very quick points. The first one is to thank James Darnbrook for all of the work behind the scenes to make this go off smoothly, to bring people in and out of the discussion without any hitches, especially difficult when you've got a toddler trying to walk on your keyboard, and thank you so much for that. And finally, really thanks to our wonderful panelists who I think continue to demonstrate the value of empirical deep field research, and I think show the kind of wisdom about these complex settings that I don't see much out there. And there really isn't any replacement for understanding these settings from the ground up. Hopefully vaccination campaigns will allow all of you to get back out there soon. Follow these people on Twitter, read their work. They're really the leading thinkers and they're worth learning from on a constant basis. And I'll now let them get back to their important day jobs. And thank you all for joining this event. Goodbye.